Before we go any further, take a second to settle in. If this kind of slow, thoughtful history helps you relax, tap like, subscribe if you enjoy this style, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I read them, especially when people tell me they're winding down after a long day. Now, let's ease into this together. Most of the systems that quietly control modern life were not invented by calm thinkers sitting at desks. They were invented by exhausted people standing in the aftermath of disaster, surrounded by smoke, sickness, or silence where noise used to be. Medieval life was fragile. One bad harvest, one ship arriving with the wrong kind of cough, one spark carried by the wind, and an entire city could unravel. There was no manual for this, no experts in the modern sense, just pattern recognition driven by fear and repetition. Take quarantine, for example. Today it sounds medical, technical, even boring. In the medieval world, it was nothing more than a desperate pause button. Port cities noticed something unsettling long before anyone understood disease. A ship would arrive, trade would resume, taverns would fill, and within days people would start dying in clusters that felt too familiar to ignore. Someone eventually connected the dots. Not scientifically, but emotionally. This did not happen before the ship came, so they delayed the next one. Not forever, just long enough to see what happened. 40 days was not holy or precise. It was practical. Long enough for sickness to reveal itself. Long enough for fear to settle into routine. Ships waited offshore. Travelers were held outside walls. Goods sat untouched, as if illness needed time to lose interest. Being quarantined was humiliating. You were not guilty, but you were suspicious. Guards watched you eat. Conversations happened from a distance. You were isolated not because anyone hated you, but because everyone was terrified of what you might carry without knowing it. Inside the city, quarantine created something powerful. The illusion of control. People believed that waiting, walls, and distance could protect them. Sometimes they were wrong. Sometimes they were right, just often enough for the idea to survive. Fewer people died. Panic slowed. And when something works even slightly during a crisis, it stops being temporary. It becomes policy. Over time, this medieval improvisation hardened into law, then tradition, then science. Modern public health traces one of its strongest roots back to officials who simply said, "Stand over there and we'll see what happens." The same kind of thinking shaped bureaucracy. Medieval rulers did not love paperwork. They feared chaos. During emergencies, memory failed spectacularly. Who paid taxes? Who owned land? Who was still alive? Verbal orders dissolved into arguments. So they wrote things down. Names, lists, properties, debts. This was not efficiency. It was survival. Ink preserved reality when panic tried to erase it. Clerks became emergency workers. While soldiers fought and healers guessed, someone sat hunched over a desk recording facts so society wouldn't forget itself. People hated it immediately. Forms were confusing. Rules felt arbitrary. Officials were slow. None of that is new. But bureaucracy had one unbeatable advantage. It still worked when shouting did not. And once the crisis passed, the record stayed. Written systems proved useful. They reduced fights. They stabilized authority. Temporary damage control became permanent administration. Time itself was another medieval casualty of emergency. Before crises demanded coordination, time was flexible. Noon was when the sun felt right. Dawn was a suggestion. That worked until people needed to act together. Fires, invasions, food shortages all exposed how useless vague timekeeping was. Meet at dawn meant nothing if dawn meant something different to everyone. So cities standardized time, not for science, for obedience. Bells rang at fixed hours. Missed the bell and that was your fault. Mechanical clocks followed. They were inaccurate, loud, and expensive but consistent. Consistency mattered more than precision. Guards changed shifts reliably. Curfews could be enforced. Food distribution became possible. People complained, but now they complained on schedule. This intrusion into daily life felt unnatural because it was medieval life had followed seasons and daylight. Now it followed bells. But once adopted, time discipline never left. It made emergencies manageable instead of frantic. Today we measure life in minutes, panic when batteries die, and feel uneasy when time becomes ambiguous again. All because medieval people once needed everyone to show up at the same moment or everything would fall apart. Cities, once they survived long enough, began to notice that emergencies were not random acts of fate. They followed paths. Disease followed filth. Fire followed density. Panic followed darkness. These were not moral failures or divine moods. They were environmental problems, even if medieval people did not have that language yet. They simply had experience, and experience was persuasive. Street cleaning was not born from a love of cleanliness. Medieval streets were working spaces. People walked there, sold there, repaired tools there, and dumped absolutely everything there. Animal waste, butcher scraps, broken pottery, spoiled food, and whatever else needed to disappear was generously added to the street and left for rain to solve. Rain, as it turned out, was unreliable. When disease arrived, it arrived first where rot lingered longest. Graveyards filled faster in neighborhoods that smelled like decay. No one understood bacteria, but pattern recognition did not require microscopes. Officials noticed that areas drowning in waste were also drowning in death. So emergency orders appeared. Clear the street, dig gutters, push waste away from living spaces and toward rivers, pits, or the edge of town. This did not solve the problem. It relocated it, but relocation was enough to matter. The smell lessened, insects retreated, people stopped dying quite so fast. This was aggressive cleanliness fueled by fear, not pride. Fines were imposed. Entire streets were ordered to clean themselves at once, which mostly meant shouting and uneven results. People complained loudly about inconvenience, cost, and unfair enforcement. This is comforting because it means human behavior has remained consistent for centuries. Still, it worked just well enough. Emergency cleanups became routine. Routine became jobs. Jobs became infrastructure. Gutters turned into sewers. What began as someone yelling, "Get rid of that before we all perish," quietly evolved into modern sanitation systems. Fire forced a similar reckoning. Medieval cities were perfect fuel. Wood, thatch, narrow streets, open flames, and wind combined into a partnership dedicated to destruction. One spark could erase neighborhoods. Fires did not creep. They ran. Flames jumped roofs like they had intent. People rebuilt the same way over and over until repetition became education. After watching cities burn for the third or fourth time, authorities reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Maybe this kept happening because of how cities were built. Emergency rules followed. Thatched roofs were banned in dense areas. Stone and tile were encouraged or forced. Buildings were spaced apart to limit how easily fire could spread. Hearths were regulated. Chimneys inspected. Open flames became everyone's business. People hated these rules. Stone was expensive. Tile was heavy. Spacing buildings meant giving up valuable land. Artisans complained. Landowners complained louder. Everyone complained until the next fire arrived and reminded them why the rules existed. Fire codes did not stop fires. They slowed them. Neighborhoods survived instead of vanishing. Rebuilding became manageable instead of constant. And once again, the emergency fix stayed. Modern building codes trace their lineage directly back to this trauma. Inspections, material requirements, spacing regulations all descend from medieval cities trying to stop reliving the same nightmare. Today we call it safety. Then it was survival. Darkness introduced another problem. Night magnified mistakes. Fires started more easily. Crime became bolder. Arguments escalated faster. During emergencies, nighttime turned manageable situations into disasters. Before curfews, cities tried trust. They assumed people would behave responsibly. This assumption collapsed quickly. Curfews were not moral statements. They were containment strategies. Bells rang. Gates closed. Movement stopped. If you were outside, you needed a reason. Guards questioned wanderers. Streets grew quieter. Fires were spotted sooner. Disease spread more slowly. Authorities could tell who belonged and who did not. People hated curfews immediately. Night felt like freedom. But curfews worked well enough to matter, so they became tools pulled out whenever things went wrong. All of this required authority to be visible. During chaos, knowing who to listen to mattered more than knowing why. Medieval cities solved this by dressing authority differently. Guards wore specific colors. Officials carried symbols. Messengers dressed distinctly. Uniforms were not about style. They were shortcuts. If someone looked official, people obeyed faster. In emergencies, speed mattered. People resented uniforms then just as they do now. They symbolize control. But when panic arrives, everyone wants very clear instructions from someone who looks like they're allowed to give them. If this is holding your attention, tell me in the comments which of these systems you never realized came from fear rather than planning. We're moving next into food, rationing, and the math of survival that reshaped how societies handle scarcity. When emergencies dragged on longer than anyone hoped, medieval cities discovered something far more dangerous than disease or fire. Hunger. Fear could be managed. Smoke cleared. Illness eventually burned through a population. But hunger rewired people quickly and without mercy. A full granary could empty in days once panic set in, and when bread disappeared, authority vanished with it. At first, cities tried optimism. Officials encouraged moderation. They asked people to be reasonable, to buy only what they needed, to trust that supplies would last. Medieval history is brutally honest about how that went. The wealthy hoarded. The desperate panicked. Prices exploded overnight. Markets turned violent. Fights broke out over sacks of grain that were half mold and half hope. Someone always tried to sell flour that was mostly ground bone or dust, and someone else always believed them. So rulers stepped in with a solution no one enjoyed: control. Rationing was not about fairness in a modern sense. It was arithmetic. If everyone took as much as they wanted, everyone would starve faster. If everyone took a little, some might survive long enough for things to improve. Grain was regulated first because bread riots were fast, loud, and lethal. Bakeries were monitored. Flour supplies tracked. Hoarders punished harshly, not because officials were virtuous, but because hungry crowds were unpredictable and dangerous. Fuel followed the same logic. Wood, peat, charcoal, anything that kept people warm or allowed them to cook became precious. During shortages, burning too much was suddenly a crime. Buying too much was suspicious. Survival required restraint, whether people agreed or not. Complaints were constant. Accusations of favoritism flew freely. And yes, corruption existed. Humans have always been very good at bending rules during scarcity. But rationing worked just enough. Panic slowed. Violence decreased. Order returned in thin, fragile layers. Once emergencies ended, rationing systems often stayed. They stabilized prices. They made shortages less catastrophic. Over time, what began as emergency control turned into standard crisis management. Modern food limits, fuel restrictions, and supply controls all follow this medieval math. When resources shrink and fear grows, unregulated freedom collapses faster than regulation ever does. Hunger also taught medieval societies the value of preparation. Early communities lived dangerously close to the edge. Grain came once a year. Fuel was seasonal. If something went wrong, there was no backup. People simply ran out of food and then ran out of time. This happened often enough that someone eventually asked an uncomfortable question. What if we didn't eat everything immediately? Emergency stockpiles were born from remembered suffering. Granaries were built to store grain beyond immediate need. Armories stored weapons so they did not have to be made during panic. Fuel reserves were set aside for winter and siege. These stockpiles were not signs of abundance. They were scars. Every full storehouse represented a famine someone remembered too clearly. Stockpiling was controversial. Grain locked away felt cruel when mouths were hungry. Rulers were accused of hoarding. Theft was common. Mismanagement happened. But when emergencies arrived, reserves mattered. Cities with stockpiles lasted longer. Sieges failed. Winters became survivable instead of fatal. Panic slowed, and when panic slowed, people behaved more rationally. Preparation also changed behavior. Knowing supplies existed reduced hoarding. Reduced hoarding reduced violence. Order followed not because people became kinder, but because fear loosened its grip. Over time, emergency reserves became permanent institutions. Laws protected them. Access was regulated. Modern emergency stockpiles follow the same logic. Store now so you don't panic later. None of this worked without coordination, and coordination required clarity. During medieval emergencies, confusion often killed faster than the crisis itself. Fires, riots, invasions, outbreaks all shared one weakness. Nobody knew who to listen to. When everyone shouted instructions at once, authority dissolved into noise. So cities made authority visible and unavoidable. Public warning systems emerged from this need. Church bells rang for fires, invasions, riots, curfews. Different rhythms meant different threats, though most people simply heard bell and assumed something terrible was happening, which was usually correct. Sound traveled faster than messengers. Rich or poor, asleep or awake, if the bell rang, you heard it. Flags flew from towers. Fires were lit on hills. Horns blasted patterns people learned to recognize instinctively. Drop what you're doing. Look around. Follow instructions. Panic later. False alarms happened. People complained. But even false alarms trained attention. Better brief fear than silent death. When survival depended on skill, medieval societies discovered that optimism was a liability. For a long time, life operated on a simple assumption. If someone said they knew how to do something, that was probably good enough. This worked reasonably well for farming advice and storytelling. It failed spectacularly during emergencies, when mistakes stopped being embarrassing and started being fatal. During plagues, untrained healers treated neighbors with absolute confidence and alarming creativity. During fires and sieges, poorly built shelters collapsed just when people needed them most. During famines, incompetent bakers produced bread that made people sick or furious, often both. In calm times, incompetence was survivable. In crisis, it multiplied damage. Eventually, medieval cities reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Not everyone should be allowed to do everything. So they intervened. Guilds were formed, not as friendly professional clubs, but as emergency filters. If you wanted to practice a trade that affected survival, you had to prove you knew what you were doing. You trained under a master. You followed rules. You demonstrated competence. If you failed, you were stopped before you harmed more people. This was not about excellence or innovation. It was about limiting disaster. Medical licensing began as an attempt to stop enthusiastic amateurs from experimenting on neighbors during outbreaks. Building standards emerged after too many emergency structures collapsed under stress. Food regulations followed repeated poisonings and riots caused by unsafe bread. Licensing was not protectionism at first. It was triage. People hated it immediately. Unlicensed workers complained that rules were unfair. Masters guarded entry fiercely. Accusations of favoritism spread quickly. Some systems became corrupt, restrictive, and frustrating because humans are involved in all systems. But licensing worked just enough. Cities with regulated trades suffered fewer secondary disasters during emergencies. Buildings lasted longer. Food became safer. Treatments became less lethal. Once authorities saw measurable improvement, licensing stopped being temporary. Modern certifications, permits, exams, and professional credentials all descend from this medieval realization. Letting untrained people practice critical skills during crisis is a bad idea. A very bad idea. We now take this for granted, but it exists because medieval societies learned that, trust me, I know what I'm doing is not a safety standard. Competence also required rules that survived panic. Before written law became common, medieval justice relied heavily on memory and custom. This worked until emergencies arrived and everyone remembered things differently. During plagues, riots, and famines, verbal law collapsed. Arguments multiplied. Officials contradicted each other. Witnesses lied or panicked. Courts turned into shouting matches where facts drowned. So authorities wrote the rules down, not because they loved clarity, but because ambiguity was dangerous. Written laws shortened arguments. They did not eliminate injustice, but they reduced debate. And in emergencies, time mattered more than fairness. Laws were posted publicly, carved into stone, copied into books. Even people who could not read understood that written rules meant something serious was happening. People resented this immediately. Written law removed flexibility. You could no longer argue that you remembered things differently. Officials could point to text and say it's right there. Law became colder, more rigid, and harder to negotiate with, which was exactly the point. During emergencies, predictability mattered more than kindness. Once crises passed, written laws did not disappear. They proved useful. They reduced disputes. They allowed authority to scale beyond personal relationships. Over time, law transformed from custom into institution. Modern legal systems still rely on this medieval lesson. Memory fails under stress. Writing survives panic. All of this reshaped cities themselves. Medieval cities were not planned. They happened. Buildings stacked wherever space appeared. Streets twisted without logic. In peaceful times, this was charming. During emergencies, it was deadly. Fires raced through narrow alleys. Disease spread through cramped neighborhoods. Defense and evacuation became chaos. After enough disasters, authorities realized the city itself was part of the problem. Emergency fixes appeared. Streets were widened to slow fires. Open spaces were created as fire breaks and gathering points. Certain trades were pushed away from residential areas because tanners and butchers made emergencies worse. This was not beauty-driven planning. It was regret. People resisted. Wider streets meant less building space. Relocation meant expense. Regulations felt intrusive. Citizens complained that planners were ruining the character of their neighborhoods, which is reassuring because humans have complained about urban planning forever. But the results were undeniable. Fires spread more slowly. Disease transmission decreased. Emergency response improved. By the time medieval societies reached this point, they had learned a hard truth. You could not manage emergencies if you did not know who people were, where they belonged, and why they were moving. In calm times, strangers were curiosities. In crisis, they became questions that demanded answers immediately. Every unfamiliar face carried risk, not because it was evil, but because it was unknown. Movement was the first problem. During plagues, famine, or invasion, people fled. They left sick towns and flooded healthy ones. They carried rumors faster than truth and illness faster than anyone realized. Cities that allowed unrestricted movement often paid for it in bodies. So emergency controls appeared. Gates closed. Roads were monitored. Travelers were stopped and questioned, sometimes turned away even when they begged. This was not cruelty. It was containment. Officials needed to slow the flow of uncertainty. You could not trace disease, crime, or unrest if people vanished into crowds. So cities began issuing travel permissions. Papers that said who you were, where you came from, and why you were allowed to move. Without them, you stayed put. These early passes were crude. Handwritten notes, wax seals, marks recognized by guards who trusted symbols more than stories. Forgery happened quickly. Bribes followed. Still, movement controls worked just enough. Disease spread slowed. Criminals were easier to catch. Food supplies could be predicted instead of guessed. Temporary passes became common tools during emergencies. And once they existed, authorities never forgot how useful they were. Identity itself became regulated. In small villages, everyone knew everyone. Cities broke that intimacy. During crisis, anonymity was dangerous. Officials needed ways to separate residents from outsiders, workers from wanderers, citizens from threats. Clothing became a signal. Badges identified trades. Symbols marked status. Certain groups were forced to wear visible markers, a practice that would later be abused terribly, but which began as crude identification in chaotic environments. Night intensified this need. Darkness erased faces. Voices carried without bodies attached. So authorities demanded light. Lantern laws required people to carry visible flames after dark. Homes were ordered to keep lights in windows. Streets glowed faintly, not for beauty, but for accountability. If you could be seen, you could be questioned. If you could be questioned, you could be controlled. People resented this deeply. Light felt invasive. Identity markers felt humiliating. Movement restrictions felt suffocating. But when emergencies returned, and they always did, these systems reduced chaos. Guards could spot trouble faster. Fires were seen earlier. Crime dropped slightly. Disease spread slowed. Slight improvements mattered when death counted in thousands. Behavior itself was next. Medieval authorities realized that fear did not just move people, it changed them. Panic made crowds volatile. Words sparked riots. Rumors traveled faster than messengers. During emergencies, speech became dangerous. So cities tried to regulate it. Public proclamations replaced gossip. Official announcements were read aloud in squares so everyone heard the same version at the same time. Unauthorized warnings were punished. Spreading false news became a crime. Not because truth was protected, but because consistency was. Conflicting stories shattered trust. Unified messaging held it together just long enough. This is where censorship quietly entered daily life. Not as ideology, but as emergency management. Authorities limited what could be said publicly during crises. Sermons were monitored. Town criers followed scripts. Even tavern talk drew attention when panic ran high. People complained bitterly, but fewer riots followed. Fewer stampedes happened. Control of information reduced emotional spikes. Once emergencies passed, information control remained. It proved useful for taxes, law, and authority in general. What began as stop spreading rumors or people will die evolved into regulated communication. Modern emergency alerts, official press briefings, and restricted information zones all echo this medieval fear of uncontrolled speech. None of this worked without enforcement. Medieval policing emerged from crisis, not order. Early guards were not peacekeepers. They were emergency responders. They watched gates, enforced curfews, broke up crowds, and detained suspicious people. They were blunt instruments, often unfair, sometimes brutal, but they gave authority physical presence. Uniforms mattered again. Weapons mattered. Visibility mattered. If people believed someone was watching, behavior changed. Not always for the better, but often for the calmer. Over time, these emergency watchers became standing forces. Policing became permanent. If you've made it this far, tap like. It helps this long story find the right listeners. Next, we'll explore how medieval emergencies reshaped family life, labor, and social roles in ways that still quietly shape modern expectations. Emergencies did not just reorganize cities. They rearranged families. When disaster struck, medieval societies learned quickly that the household was not just a private space. It was a unit of survival, labor, and control. What happened inside homes mattered deeply to authorities once crises made private behavior public business. Plagues were the first to force this shift. When illness spread through close quarters, family care became dangerous. Nursing the sick was an act of love that often turned into a death sentence. Entire households vanished within weeks. Cities watched this pattern repeat until they intervened. Sick family members were removed from homes and placed in isolation houses. Children were separated from parents. Spouses were split apart. These decisions were brutal, and they were not made lightly, but fear outweighed sentiment. People resisted fiercely. Families hid the sick. They lied to officials. They locked doors. Some did this out of hope, others out of terror. Authorities responded with inspections. Homes were searched. Marks were painted on doors to warn others away. Guards were posted. The home stopped being sacred. It became inspectable, regulatable, and accountable. This intrusion never fully retreated. Once authorities realized that private spaces could endanger public survival, oversight became easier to justify. Today, we still accept inspections, evacuations, and mandatory removals during emergencies, all rooted in this medieval realization that privacy bends under pressure. Labor followed the same path. Medieval work was seasonal, flexible, and family-based. Crises shattered that rhythm. When plague killed workers or war pulled men away, essential labor vanished. Food production dropped. Repairs stopped. Supply chains broke before anyone knew what to call them. So authorities reassigned labor. Bakers were ordered to bake. Farmers were forbidden from leaving land. Artisans were compelled to produce specific goods. This was not employment as opportunity. It was obligation. Skill became a resource the city claimed during need. Women's roles shifted sharply here. With men dead or absent, women took over workshops, farms, and businesses out of necessity. This was not ideological progress. It was arithmetic. Someone had to work or everyone would starve. Women brewed beer, ran shops, managed estates, and supervised labor because the alternative was collapse. When emergencies passed, some of these changes reversed. Many did not. Once women had proven they could manage essential work, it was harder to argue they could not. Medieval crises cracked social rules that had seemed permanent. Not out of fairness, but survival. Children were reshaped too. Orphans became common after plagues and wars. Cities could not ignore them. Unsupervised children became beggars, thieves, and future instability. So authorities intervened. Apprenticeships expanded. Orphanages formed. Children were placed into labor early, not for kindness but to integrate them into order. Education itself changed under pressure. Teaching had once been informal, religious, or elite. Emergencies required practical knowledge. Counting, measuring, reading instructions, following written orders. Literacy spread not because people loved books, but because illiteracy slowed response. Written notices meant nothing if no one could read them. This is where mass education quietly took root. Not as enlightenment, but as efficiency. Teaching people enough to obey instructions during crisis saved lives. That lesson stuck. Even marriage felt emergency pressure. After population loss, authorities encouraged unions. Widows were urged to remarry. Laws adjusted inheritance to keep property productive. Love mattered less than stability. Families became economic engines, not just emotional ones. All of this reshaped expectations. Work became duty. Family became responsibility to the state. Childhood shortened. Gender roles flexed under pressure. These changes were not planned reforms. They were reactions to repeated disaster. Money in calm times is a quiet agreement. During emergencies, it becomes an argument. Medieval societies learned this the hard way over and over again. When crises struck, coins did not disappear, but trust in them did. And once trust cracked, the entire system started to wobble. Plagues thinned populations so suddenly that normal economic rhythms collapsed. Debtors died. Creditors died. Records vanished. People who owed money could no longer be found, and people who were owed money were often buried without anyone knowing their claims. Markets slowed, then froze. No one wanted to trade with someone who might not be alive next week. Coins circulated more slowly, as if fear itself made them heavier. Rulers responded with emergency measures that felt radical at the time. Debts were suspended. Interest was frozen. Collections were delayed. This was not generosity. It was damage control. Forcing repayment during crisis only accelerated collapse. If farmers lost land while fields sat untended, food disappeared. If artisans lost tools, production stopped. Temporarily pausing debt kept the system breathing. Creditors hated this. Loudly, they argued that contracts were sacred. Authorities replied, sometimes explicitly, that survival mattered more than promises. Once again, emergency logic overruled principle. And once that line had been crossed, it never fully closed again. Modern bankruptcy protections, debt moratoriums, and emergency financial freezes all echo this medieval decision to pause the rules so the game could continue. Coinage itself became unstable. During wars and famines, rulers needed money quickly. Mining was slow, so they did something desperate. They debased coins. Precious metals were diluted with cheaper ones. Coins looked the same but were worth less. This solved short-term problems and created long-term distrust. Merchants tested coins with bytes and scales. Prices rose. Inflation, though unnamed, was deeply felt. People complained bitterly about bad money. They hid older coins. They refused certain payments. They raised prices preemptively. Authorities learned a painful lesson. Currency only works if people believe in it. Emergency fixes that undermine trust carry consequences that last long after the crisis ends. Out of this chaos emerged regulation. Mints were standardized. Weights were enforced. Severe punishments awaited counterfeiters. Not because rulers loved fairness, but because unstable money made emergencies worse. Consistent currency became a tool of stability. Even flawed stability was better than panic-driven barter. Trust also reshaped banking. Medieval banking did not begin with vaults and marble halls. It began with safekeeping during fear. Wealthy individuals, churches, and institutions stored money for others when homes became unsafe. Fires destroyed chests. Looters followed chaos. Centralized storage felt safer. Over time, these custodians noticed something. Not everyone wanted their money at the same time. Some of it just sat. So it was lent. Carefully at first, then more confidently. Banking emerged not from ambition, but from emergency behavior repeated often enough to feel normal. Interest, too, was shaped by crisis. Charging for loans was controversial and often condemned. But emergencies made borrowing unavoidable. Tools had to be replaced, crops replanted, ransoms paid. Lending with conditions spread because the alternative was paralysis. Moral arguments softened when survival was at stake. Insurance followed quietly. Merchants noticed that losses were inevitable. Ships sank. Fires burned warehouses. Instead of each disaster ruining one family, groups began sharing risk. Everyone paid a little. When disaster struck, the loss was spread. This idea, born from repeated emergency ruin, eventually became insurance as we know it. None of these systems were elegant. They were patched together under pressure. They were argued over, abused, and resented. But they worked just enough. They reduced total collapse. They allowed recovery instead of endless reset. If you're listening on your phone right now, maybe winding down, this is a good moment to pause and tap like. Long stories like this survive on small signals that they matter. When systems cracked and money failed to reassure, medieval people turned instinctively to meaning. Emergencies stripped away routines that made life feel predictable. And when predictability vanished, belief rushed in to fill the silence. Religion did not simply comfort people during crisis. It organized them, disciplined them, and sometimes frightened them into compliance when nothing else worked. At first, disaster was interpreted as judgment. Plagues, floods, fires, and famine were read as messages. Something had gone wrong. Someone had offended God. The solution seemed obvious. Apologize harder. Public repentance followed. Processions filled streets. Entire cities walked together behind crosses and banners, chanting, fasting, and pleading for mercy. These rituals were not private prayers. They were collective emergency responses. Authorities encouraged them because they created order. A moving crowd was easier to manage than a panicking one. Shared rituals synchronized emotion. Fear turned into action. Action turned into exhaustion. Exhaustion calmed people. Even when nothing improved, people felt they were doing something, and that feeling mattered. But ritual also became dangerous. Crowds spread disease. Processions during plagues sometimes accelerated death. Eventually, authorities noticed the pattern and did something unexpected. They restricted religious behavior. Processions were banned. Churches closed. Gatherings were limited. This shocked people. Faith had always been the solution. Now it was part of the problem. This was one of the first times medieval society chose public safety over public worship. Not permanently, but long enough to matter. Religion did not disappear. It adapted. Prayers moved indoors. Bells rang without crowds. Clergy preached restraint instead of assembly. The idea that belief could continue without physical gathering was radical at the time. Today it feels familiar. Clergy themselves became emergency workers. Priests recorded deaths when officials could not keep up. Monks ran hospitals. Nuns cared for the sick when others fled. This was not pure charity. It was structure. Religious institutions had buildings, discipline, and continuity when governments faltered. They filled gaps because someone had to. Over time, this expanded their authority. Churches became centers for record-keeping, aid distribution, and coordination. People trusted them not because they were perfect, but because they were present. Emergency usefulness translated into long-term influence. Belief also shaped behavior through fear. During crises, moral rules tightened. Gambling, drinking, and perceived excess were restricted. Not because vice caused disaster, but because discipline reduced chaos. Emergency morality emerged. Be orderly. Be restrained. Be obedient. Sin became less about theology and more about social stability. Scapegoating followed quickly. When meaning was scarce, blame felt necessary. Outsiders, minorities, and the unfamiliar were accused of causing disaster. This was not random hatred. It was fear seeking shape. Authorities sometimes encouraged it, sometimes fought it, depending on what reduced unrest fastest. These moments left scars that lasted far longer than the crises themselves. But emergencies also softened belief in strange ways. When death became common, rigid distinctions blurred. Class barriers weakened. Charity increased. People shared food more readily when tomorrow felt uncertain. End-of-life rituals became simpler, more personal. The idea that everyone was equally fragile crept quietly into thinking. Funerals changed too. Mass death forced efficiency. Individual mourning gave way to collective remembrance. Cemeteries expanded. Memorial practices standardized. Death became managed rather than purely emotional. This shift still echoes today in how societies respond to large-scale loss. Medicine in the medieval world was not a confident science. It was a collection of habits, guesses, inherited rules, and desperate improvisation. Emergencies exposed this brutally. When plagues arrived, traditional medicine did not just fail quietly. It failed publicly, repeatedly, and in ways no one could ignore. At first, doctors relied on balance. Illness was blamed on humors being out of alignment. Too much heat, too much cold, too much moisture. Treatments followed theory instead of observation. Blood was drained. Bodies were purged. Patients were weakened in the name of restoration. Sometimes people recovered. Often they did not. During mass outbreaks, patterns became impossible to deny. The treatments were not saving enough people to justify the suffering they caused. This did not immediately create modern medicine. What it created was doubt, and doubt is powerful during crisis. When the usual answers stop working, people begin to watch instead of assume. They noticed that caregivers who touched fewer patients survived longer. That households which isolated recovered members sometimes fared better. That certain practices spread illness faster than others. Doctors resisted these ideas at first. Tradition carried authority. But emergencies do not respect authority. They reveal results. Slowly, begrudgingly, practices changed. Physicians began avoiding direct contact when possible. Tools were cleaned, not for hygiene as we understand it, but because dirty instruments seemed to follow death. Clothing was changed. Rooms were aired out. These actions were not explained correctly, but they were remembered. Hospitals themselves changed shape under pressure. Early medieval hospitals were places of comfort, not cure. They offered food, shelter, prayer, and a place to die. Emergencies forced them to become something else. When too many sick arrived at once, separation mattered. Patients were grouped by symptoms. Beds were spaced farther apart. Ventilation improved not by design, but by removing walls when the smell became unbearable. Care routines emerged. Rounds were established so patients were checked regularly instead of randomly. Records were kept of symptoms and outcomes, not to advance science, but to track who was worsening and who might need removal. Observation became habit. Habit became method. Surgery followed a similar path. Medieval surgery was brutal, fast, and pragmatic. There was no anesthesia as we know it. Speed mattered more than precision. Emergencies forced refinement. Battlefield injuries taught surgeons which wounds could be treated and which could not. Amputation techniques improved because hesitation killed. Instruments were standardized because improvisation slowed response. Pain management, though crude, advanced under necessity. Alcohol, herbal sedatives, pressure, and positioning were used more deliberately. Survival rates improved slightly. Slight improvements mattered enormously. Public health emerged quietly here. Authorities realized that medicine alone could not stop mass illness. Environment mattered. Water sources were regulated. Wells were covered. Waste disposal was enforced more strictly during outbreaks. Burial practices were altered to reduce exposure. These were not medical breakthroughs. They were administrative ones. But they saved lives. Quarantine houses became medical spaces. People observed how long symptoms took to appear. Patterns were noted. 40 days was not sacred here either. It was enough time to learn something. Observation replaced superstition slowly, unevenly, but persistently. Medical authority itself shifted. Experience gained value. Healers who survived outbreaks earned trust regardless of formal training. This created tension with traditional scholars. Books said one thing, reality said another. Emergencies sided with reality more often than not. Women played a critical role here. Midwives, caregivers, and herbalists were present in homes when doctors were not. They saw patterns early. They noticed which practices worsened illness. Their knowledge spread quietly through communities. Some of it was later absorbed into formal medicine. Some was dismissed. Much was lost. But during emergencies, it mattered. Failure also left marks. People remembered what did not work. Bloodletting became less popular during outbreaks. Extreme purging declined. Gentle care, warmth, hydration, and rest gained favor. These changes did not come from theory. They came from watching people die less often when they were not aggressively harmed. By the end of repeated medieval crises, medicine had not become modern, but it had become humbler, less certain, more observational. That shift is foundational. Modern evidence-based medicine traces its mindset back to this era of uncomfortable learning under pressure. Knowledge does not survive emergencies unless it moves. Medieval societies learned this painfully. Information trapped in one place died with the people who held it. Fires destroyed libraries. Plagues erased teachers. Wars scattered scholars. What survived was not the most accurate knowledge, but the knowledge that traveled fastest and adapted easiest. Before repeated crises, learning was slow and localized. Skills were passed from parent to child, master to apprentice, priest to novice. This worked until an entire chain vanished at once. When a plague killed a master and his apprentices, a craft could disappear overnight. When war wiped out a monastery, generations of recorded thought vanished with it. Loss became cumulative, so emergency copying began. Texts were duplicated aggressively, sometimes sloppily but widely. Accuracy mattered less than survival. A flawed copy was better than no copy at all. Scribes worked quickly during unrest, racing fire, theft, and decay. Margins filled with notes meant to help strangers understand context if the original teacher was gone. Knowledge became portable because portability meant survival. Language shifted too. Latin remained dominant, but emergencies demanded clarity. Orders, warnings, and instructions needed to be understood immediately. Vernacular languages entered written space not for beauty, but for speed. If people could read instructions themselves, response improved. Literacy stopped being elite and became useful. This change frightened traditional scholars. Simpler language felt like dilution, but emergencies favored comprehension over prestige. Once people saw that understanding saved lives, accessibility won. Modern instructional writing, public notices, and emergency communication descend directly from this medieval compromise. Visual communication followed. Symbols replaced words where reading failed. Signs marked danger. Colors indicated status or instruction. Shapes conveyed meaning at a glance. You didn't need to read to understand stop, avoid, enter, gather. Medieval people learned to design for panic without knowing they were doing it. Maps improved under pressure. Before emergencies demanded movement and coordination, maps were symbolic and spiritual. Crisis demanded practicality. Roads, distances, landmarks, and obstacles mattered. Siege maps, evacuation routes, supply paths all required accuracy. Cartography evolved because guessing directions wasted time people didn't have. Messengers became critical infrastructure. Runners, riders, signal towers, smoke columns, drum beats, bell patterns. Speed mattered more than elegance. Reliability mattered more than detail. Emergency networks formed that ignored borders and traditions. Information took precedence over protocol. This created standardization. Messengers wore recognizable marks. Signals followed agreed patterns. Messages used consistent phrasing to avoid confusion. Today's standardized alerts and communication protocols trace their roots back to these medieval emergency shortcuts. Printing later amplified everything that crisis had already demanded. When it arrived, societies recognized its value instantly because they had lived without it during disaster. Printing was not just innovation. It was relief. Knowledge no longer depended entirely on fragile chains of human survival. Education adapted again. Schools emphasized repetition and memorization not for philosophy, but because emergencies wiped out teachers. Students needed to retain knowledge independently. Exams emerged to confirm retention. Written testing replaced oral tradition because paper outlived panic. Libraries changed purpose. They became repositories rather than temples. Books were chained, cataloged, protected from fire and theft. Classification systems emerged not for beauty, but retrieval. Find it fast or it's useless. Emergency learning also reshaped trust. People learned to value sources that proved useful during crisis. Practical manuals gained authority over abstract theory. Experience gained weight. This tension between lived knowledge and formal expertise still exists because it was forged here. Even storytelling changed. Stories carried lessons when manuals were inaccessible. Parables encoded safety rules. Folktales warned against behaviors that caused disaster. Oral knowledge adapted to survive when institutions failed. Power rarely announces itself as temporary. Medieval emergencies taught rulers that once authority expanded to manage chaos, it was very difficult to shrink it again. At first, control was justified openly. This is only until the danger passes. This is only for survival. People accepted it because fear makes almost any rule feel reasonable. During plagues, wars, and famines, local leadership proved too slow. Town councils argued. Nobles protected their own lands. Religious leaders focused on souls, not logistics. So power concentrated upward. Kings, princes, and central authorities stepped in to coordinate food, labor, defense, and law. Orders flowed from fewer mouths. Decisions happened faster. Sometimes they were wrong, but they happened. Emergency councils formed with expanded authority. They could seize property, override local customs, and suspend normal legal processes. These powers felt shocking at first. Then they felt necessary. Once people saw that decisive action reduced chaos, resistance softened. Efficiency became its own justification. Taxation followed quickly. Emergencies were expensive. Armies needed pay. Food needed purchase. Infrastructure needed repair. Temporary taxes were imposed to fund survival. People complained but paid because the alternative was worse. Once the emergency ended, the tax rarely disappeared completely. It was adjusted, renamed, normalized. Standing armies emerged the same way. Medieval forces were once temporary, raised when needed, disbanded when danger passed. Repeated emergencies revealed the flaw. Raising an army during crisis wasted time. Training during panic produced poor results. So rulers kept soldiers ready. Permanent forces felt safer, faster, more reliable. This changed everything. Armies required funding, structure, and loyalty. They answered to centralized power. Authority hardened around them. Emergency defense became continuous readiness. Modern military structures carry this legacy clearly. Law enforcement expanded similarly. Emergency guards became permanent watchmen. Surveillance that began as crisis monitoring became routine observation. Records collected during chaos proved useful during peace. Once information existed, it was hard to ignore. Legitimacy evolved alongside control. Rulers learned they needed justification beyond force. Emergencies provided narrative. We protected you. We kept order. We prevented collapse. These stories were repeated until authority felt earned rather than seized. Memory blurred the line between emergency action and rightful rule. Public rituals reinforced this. Celebrations of survival, victories over plague or famine, reinforced centralized leadership. Monuments were built, anniversaries observed. Crisis became legacy, but power consolidation came with tension. Local autonomy weakened, traditions eroded. Communities lost control over decisions that once belonged to them. Resentment simmered. Rebellions followed when authority overreached. Emergency power had limits, but discovering them often required violence. Still, the overall direction held. Centralized authority proved more resilient during repeated crises. It coordinated resources, enforced rules, and survived leadership changes. Medieval societies learned that fragmented power collapsed under pressure. This lesson shaped governance permanently. Modern states operate on assumptions forged here. That emergencies justify expanded power. That coordination matters more than consent in crisis. That temporary measures have a way of becoming permanent structures. If this part feels uncomfortably familiar, that's because these patterns repeat. History does not hide them. It reuses them. Emergency power never went unchallenged. Medieval people were not passive recipients of control, even when fear pressed them into obedience. They pushed back quietly at first, then loudly when restraint failed. Out of this tension between authority and resistance emerged something unexpected. Limits. At first, resistance looked small. People ignored curfews. They hid food from inspectors. They moved at night without permission. They passed messages secretly. These acts were not ideological. They were personal, survival-driven. But when thousands did them at once, they became political whether anyone intended that or not. Authorities responded predictably. Punishments increased. Surveillance tightened. Examples were made. And for a time, fear restored obedience. But medieval rulers learned another hard lesson. Excessive control created its own emergency. When pressure became unbearable, people stopped complying altogether. Food riots illustrate this clearly. When rationing felt unfair or corrupt, crowds gathered. Bakers were attacked. Officials were chased. Storehouses were broken open. These riots were not random violence. They followed patterns. Targets were symbolic. Crowds demanded specific changes. lower prices, fair distribution, honest weights. Rulers learned to listen, not out of kindness, but survival. Ignoring riots risked overthrow. Meeting demands calmed cities. So negotiation entered emergency governance. Authority adjusted policies not because it wanted to, but because resistance proved costly. Charters emerged from this friction. Cities demanded written guarantees in exchange for compliance, rights to trade, limits on taxation, protections against arbitrary punishment. These documents were not philosophical declarations. They were emergency compromises. Give us boundaries and we will cooperate. Once written, these limits mattered. They could be referenced during future crises. Even if rulers ignored them, their existence changed expectations. Power was no longer absolute by default. It had conditions. Courts became battlegrounds for this struggle. People challenged emergency actions legally when possible. Judges weighed necessity against custom. Precedents formed. Slowly, painfully, the idea that emergency power required justification took root. Mobility restrictions were tested here too. Merchants protested blocked roads. Farmers resisted forced labor. Pilgrims argued for religious movement. Each challenge carved exceptions into blanket rules. Over time, emergency laws became more nuanced because blunt force provoked backlash. Information control cracked under resistance as well. Underground communication flourished when official narratives lost credibility. Songs, rumors, pamphlets spread alternative explanations. Authorities learned that suppressing all speech was impossible. Instead, they focused on shaping it. This balance between control and persuasion still defines crisis communication. Even policing evolved through resistance. Brutal enforcement bred unrest. Softer approaches gained compliance. Community involvement reduced violence. Watch systems adapted to local norms. Policing became negotiated presence rather than pure force in some regions. Religion played a role again here. Moral arguments were used to challenge excess authority. Sermons framed injustice as sin. Clergy mediated between rulers and people. Emergency power was weighed against divine obligation, creating an early moral check. What emerged was not democracy, but constraint. A recognition that power without limits created instability. Emergencies justified authority, but resistance shaped its boundaries. These lessons did not end emergencies. They made them survivable without tearing societies apart every time. Modern ideas of civil liberties during crisis trace back to these medieval struggles. When emergencies repeated often enough, medieval people stopped thinking of certain behaviors as temporary. What began as crisis response slowly hardened into habit, and habit is powerful. It survives even when memory of its origin fades. This is how emergency behavior quietly became everyday life. Consider how people woke, worked, and rested. Before repeated crises, daily routines followed nature. Light dictated labor. Seasons shaped effort. Emergencies shattered this rhythm. During famine, people worked longer hours whenever food or opportunity appeared. During plague, work stopped abruptly, then restarted unevenly. Over time, authorities realized that predictable routines reduced panic. If people knew when markets opened, when bells rang, when gates closed, fear softened its grip, so fixed schedules spread. Market days became regulated, work hours standardized, rest periods enforced not for kindness, but to keep people functional. Exhausted populations broke faster. This logic stayed. Today's workday rhythms descend from medieval attempts to keep society stable during prolonged stress. Hygiene followed a similar path. Cleaning was once reactive. You cleaned when something smelled unbearable or sickness appeared. Emergencies taught people that waiting was costly. Bathing routines increased in cities that survived outbreaks. Clothing was aired. Bedding was changed more often. These habits were uneven and imperfect, but they mattered. Over time, cleanliness stopped being only emergency-driven and became expected behavior. Food habits changed permanently. During famine, people learned substitutes: cheaper grains, extended stews, preserved foods. Techniques developed to stretch calories and reduce waste. When crises ended, many of these habits remained because they worked. Modern comfort foods often trace their origins to survival meals refined during scarcity. Storage inside homes expanded. Pantries, cellars, and cupboards grew more organized. Families kept reserves not because they were wealthy, but because they remembered hunger. Even when times improved, the instinct to keep extra never fully disappeared. That anxiety echoes today when shelves empty faster than logic would suggest. Clothing norms shifted too. During emergencies, practicality mattered more than status. Durable fabrics replaced decorative ones. Layering became common to conserve heat and reduce fuel use. These choices influenced fashion slowly, grounding it in function. Many traditional styles began as emergency adaptations. Social interaction changed quietly. After plagues, people stood farther apart. Greetings softened. Touch became cautious. These behaviors lingered. Over generations, personal space expanded. What once felt cold became polite. The idea that distance could equal respect has roots in fear of contagion. Even manners were shaped by crisis. Orderly cues emerged because crowds killed. Waiting your turn reduced violence. Sharing tools reduced scarcity. Rules around fairness and patience were not moral inventions. They were survival strategies taught socially until they felt natural. Child rearing absorbed emergency logic as well. Parents emphasized obedience, listening, and caution. Wandering was dangerous. Questioning instructions could kill. These lessons passed down long after the immediate threat faded. Discipline became a form of love because it kept children alive. Sleep patterns changed under pressure. Night watches interrupted rest. Curfews shortened freedom. People learned to sleep in segments, waking easily to bells or alarms. This light sleep became normal for centuries. The idea that deep, uninterrupted rest is natural is relatively modern. Trust itself adapted. Communities learned who showed up during crisis. Reliability became more important than charm. People remembered who shared food, who enforced rules fairly, who vanished. Reputation hardened. This shaped long-term social bonds and leadership choices. What's striking is how rarely these habits were questioned once adopted. They worked. They reduced risk. And anything that reduces fear tends to stay. Over time, people forgot why they behaved this way. They just did. If you're listening quietly, maybe winding down, you're experiencing one of those habits right now. Slow stories as a way to steady the mind. If this is helping, tap like. It tells the system this kind of calm thinking still has a place. When emergencies stopped being rare and started being expected, medieval societies made a subtle but profound shift. They stopped asking if disaster would come and started asking when. That change reshaped how people thought about the future itself. Planning was no longer optimism. It became defense. Before this shift, the future was largely left to fate, God, or seasons. You planted, you hoped, you reacted. Emergencies taught people that hope without preparation was a gamble they kept losing. So foresight became a skill. Not scientific forecasting, but pattern-based expectation. What happened last winter might happen again. What failed during the last plague should not fail twice. Cities began documenting crises deliberately, not as stories but as references. When did famine hit? How long did it last? what worked, what failed. These records were not written for curiosity. They were manuals for the next disaster. Memory was externalized because human memory faded too quickly. This is where risk awareness quietly entered governance. Officials began asking questions that sound very modern. How much grain is enough? How long can we survive if trade stops? Which neighborhoods flood first? Which walls fail fastest? These questions reshaped budgets, construction, and priorities. Resources were allocated not just for now, but for imagined stress. Insurance-like thinking spread beyond money. Redundancy became valued. Multiple wells instead of one. Extra gates, backup routes, spare tools. What once felt wasteful now felt prudent. Having more than you immediately needed stopped being greed and became wisdom. Households absorbed this mindset too. Parents train children not just for normal life, but for disruption. Learn a trade that works during crisis. Marry someone reliable, not just charming. Choose homes that are defensible, not just comfortable. These calculations shaped lives quietly. Time horizons expanded unevenly. Short-term survival still mattered most, but long-term recovery gained attention. Rebuilding after fire changed. Instead of restoring exactly what was lost, people improved weak points. Stone replaced wood. Wider streets replaced narrow ones. Each rebuild carried memory forward. Prediction methods remained crude, but intention mattered more than accuracy. Watching weather patterns, monitoring crop health, tracking sickness rumors from neighboring regions. Early warning systems emerged socially. News from afar became valuable. Messengers were rewarded for speed. Delays became dangerous. This is where calendars gained weight. Not just dates, but cycles. Plague seasons, flood months, hunger gaps. People structured life around risk windows. Festivals shifted. Travel adjusted. Marriages timed around survival probability. Life planning bent around danger. Religion adapted again here. Instead of only interpreting disaster after it happened, belief systems incorporated preparedness. Prayers for protection. Blessings for journeys. Rituals before planting. Faith became forward-looking, not just reactive. This made uncertainty feel manageable. Fear itself was reinterpreted. Instead of pure panic, fear became information. Anxiety signaled vulnerability. Ignoring it felt foolish. Communities that respected fear planned better. Those that dismissed it repeated mistakes. This lesson echoes strongly today. Legal systems formalized future thinking. Contracts included contingencies. If harvest fails, if war breaks out, if disease spreads, these clauses reduced conflict later. Planning for breakdown became standard. Even storytelling changed tone. Tales warned of ignoring signs. Heroes survived because they prepared. Fools perished because they assumed safety. These stories trained intuition over generations. What's remarkable is how deeply this mindset embedded itself. Modern concepts like emergency preparedness, disaster planning, and risk management feel obvious now. But they grew from medieval exhaustion, from people tired of being surprised by the same suffering. By the time medieval emergency habits reached this stage, something important had happened. People stopped recognizing them as emergency responses at all. They simply became the way life worked. What was once strange, restrictive, or frightening slowly blended into normal expectations. And once something feels normal, it becomes invisible. Take rules. Early emergency rules were loud, temporary, and resented. Curfews, inspections, movement limits. Over time, they softened. They gained explanations. They were taught to children as common sense instead of crisis response. Don't go out too late. Keep records. Follow procedures. What began as survival instructions transformed into social norms. Architecture reflected this shift clearly. Medieval cities rebuilt after disasters did not label their changes as emergency design. Wider streets were just streets now. Fire-resistant materials were just better building. Drainage systems were simply part of construction. The memory of why these choices mattered faded, but the structures remained. Modern cities still sit on medieval fear, layered over centuries of adaptation. Work culture followed the same pattern. Obligation replaced improvisation. Showing up mattered. Being reliable mattered. Emergencies punished unpredictability. Over generations, reliability became a virtue rather than a strategy. Work schedules, contracts, and expectations hardened. Today's idea of professionalism traces directly to societies trying to function under stress without collapsing. Authority, too, lost its emergency label. Centralized power no longer needed justification through fear alone. It justified itself through continuity. This is how we've always done it. Institutions learned to present control as stability rather than reaction. People accepted this because stability felt safer than chaos, even if it meant less freedom. Documentation became unquestioned. Birth records, death records, property deeds, licenses, permits, once created to manage uncertainty, they became proof of existence. If something wasn't written, it wasn't real. This mindset feels natural now, but it grew from repeated moments when memory failed and paper saved order. Money normalized its scars as well. Emergency measures that once shocked people became background systems. Banking, insurance, credit, debt forgiveness under certain conditions. These tools still carry the logic of survival, but they're framed as finance instead of fear. Medicine, too, crossed a threshold. Observation became expectation. Records became routine. Hospitals became places of treatment, not just comfort. While science advanced later, the mindset shift happened here. Question what fails. Keep what works. That habit is foundational. Social trust changed permanently. People learned to rely less on goodwill and more on systems. Locks replaced trust. Laws replaced promises. Procedures replaced personal judgment. This wasn't cynicism. It was adaptation. Systems didn't panic the way people did. Even emotions adapted. Medieval people learned to live with constant background anxiety. Over time, that anxiety became managed rather than explosive. Worry turned into planning, fear into caution, panic into protocol. This emotional discipline became cultural inheritance. What's striking is how rarely modern people recognize this lineage. We assume these systems emerged from rational design, scientific progress, or Enlightenment thinking. In reality, many were born from desperation. From people improvising under pressure and keeping whatever reduced suffering, even slightly. This is why emergency thinking is still powerful today. When something breaks, societies do not invent entirely new responses. They reach backward instinctively, pulling from deep patterns shaped long ago. Lockdowns, rationing, curfews, centralized authority, documentation, all feel familiar because they are. If you've stayed with this story this long, you're engaging with history in its quiet form. Not dates and battles, but habits that survived because they worked when nothing else did. If this kind of long, steady storytelling helps you relax or think more clearly, tap like. Tells the system there's room for depth. By the early edge of what we now call the modern world, medieval emergency systems no longer felt medieval to the people living inside them. They felt inherited, natural, almost inevitable. Children grew up assuming that records existed, that authorities could intervene, that rules appeared during danger and stayed afterward. No one questioned the origin anymore. The system simply was. One of the clearest shifts happened in how people understood crisis itself. In the early medieval mind, disaster was interruption. Life stopped. Normal rules paused. Survival replaced structure. But repeated emergencies taught a different lesson. Crisis was not an interruption of life. It was part of life. So life reorganized around it. This is where drills, rehearsals, and practiced responses quietly emerged. Fire brigades trained before fires. Watchmen practiced calls before invasions. Cities ran simulations without naming them as such. Bells rang at odd hours. Gates were closed unexpectedly. People complained, but they learned where to go, what to do, and how fast panic could spread. Muscle memory replaced improvisation. Once this mindset existed, response speed changed everything. Emergencies no longer created total confusion. They created tension, fear, and loss, but within a known framework. That framework reduced secondary disasters. Stampedes decreased. Riots slowed. Fires were contained sooner. The system didn't prevent suffering, but it limited collapse. This also reshaped responsibility. In early emergencies, survival felt individual. Save yourself. Protect your family. Later, survival became collective. Everyone had a role. Some watched. Some reported. Some enforced. Some complied. This distribution of responsibility made crisis manageable at scale. Social pressure enforced this participation. People who ignored rules during emergencies were judged harshly. Not just legally, but socially. Reputations suffered. Trust eroded. Communities remembered who broke quarantine, who hoarded, who lied. This social memory reinforced compliance long after formal enforcement ended. Technology followed the same path. Tools developed for crisis use became everyday tools. Fire buckets stayed visible. Alarm systems remained installed. Storage spaces stayed stocked. What was once emergency equipment became background infrastructure. Transportation adapted too. Roads were improved not for commerce alone, but for evacuation and supply movement. Bridges were reinforced because collapse during crisis was catastrophic. Ports reorganized traffic to control disease and inspection. Modern logistics grew from these survival-driven upgrades. Language changed subtly. Words like order, safety, regulation, compliance gained neutral or positive meanings. They lost their emergency tone. Authority learned to speak calmly even when acting forcefully. This rhetorical shift mattered. People resist panic commands. They accept steady ones. Law absorbed emergency thinking fully here. Special powers became embedded clauses. Exceptional authority became conditional authority. If this happens, then this applies. Crisis logic was written directly into governance. It no longer needed improvisation. Even memory changed. Societies began commemorating disasters not just as tragedies, but as lessons. Fires remembered for what they taught. Plagues remembered for reforms they triggered. Memory became instructional rather than purely mournful. This is where medieval emergency thinking fully crossed the threshold. It stopped being reactive and became anticipatory. Systems no longer waited to break before acting. They watched for stress signals and intervened early. That shift defines modern crisis management. Over time, the most powerful result of medieval emergency thinking was not the systems themselves, but how invisible they became. When something is always there, people stop questioning it. Rules fade into background noise. Procedures feel natural. Authority feels expected. And that invisibility carries a cost. Once emergency systems became permanent, people forgot that they were designed for stress, not comfort. Bureaucracy, for example, was never meant to feel humane. It was meant to function when emotions ran high and memory failed. Forms, cues, permissions, and verifications all existed to slow chaos, not to make life pleasant. But as generations passed, people began to expect these systems to feel fair, flexible, and kind. When they didn't, frustration grew. This mismatch created tension. People judged systems by moral standards rather than survival logic. Why is this rule so rigid? Why can't someone just make an exception? Why does the process take so long? These questions are reasonable in calm times, but the systems answering them were never redesigned for calm. They were inherited from fear. The same blindness applied to authority. Emergency power had once been accepted because danger was visible. When danger faded, power remained. People struggled to understand why control still existed when threat felt abstract. This created cycles of trust and resentment. In quiet periods, authority felt intrusive. In crisis, it felt necessary again. Societies swung back and forth, never fully resolving the contradiction. Infrastructure suffered a similar fate. Drainage systems, fire codes, inspections, storage requirements all existed to prevent disasters people rarely saw anymore. Maintenance felt annoying. Costs felt excessive. Corners were cut. Over time, systems decayed quietly. When emergencies returned, failures shocked people who had forgotten why these precautions mattered in the first place. Memory loss played a role here. Medieval societies tried to preserve lessons through records and rituals, but memory still faded. New generations had not seen mass fire, famine, or plague. Warnings sounded exaggerated. Preparedness felt paranoid. Risk felt theoretical. This cycle repeated endlessly. Preparedness rose after disaster and declined with comfort. Education also struggled with this blindness. Emergency logic was rarely taught explicitly. People learned procedures without learning why they existed. Drills became boring. Instructions felt pointless. Compliance dropped. Only after failure did curiosity return. This pattern shaped modern responses more than we like to admit. When new emergencies arrived, societies didn't lack tools. They lacked belief. Systems worked only if people trusted their purpose. When trust failed, compliance fractured. Language masked this problem. We stopped calling measures emergency responses and started calling them policy. Policy feels optional. Emergency feels urgent. When danger isn't named clearly, people interpret rules as preference rather than protection. Technology deepened invisibility. Automation removed visible effort. Systems worked silently until they didn't. When failure came, it felt sudden and unfair, even though it followed long neglect. Social behavior reflected this too. Courtesy replaced caution. Efficiency replaced redundancy. Optimization replaced safety margins. These choices made life smoother but more fragile. Medieval societies had learned to value excess and backup because loss was frequent. Modern life learned to value speed and convenience because loss felt distant. This fragility revealed itself when modern crises echoed medieval ones. Supply disruptions, disease spread, information chaos, authority expansion, panic buying. All the old patterns returned, startling people who believed they lived beyond them. What shocked many was not the crisis itself, but how familiar the response felt. Lockdowns, curfews, rationing, documentation, movement control. Emergency language returned from deep memory. Societies reached backward instinctively, not creatively. This is the price of forgetting origins. When systems feel arbitrary, people resist them. When systems are remembered as survival tools, people tolerate them. The difference is narrative, not structure. Remembering where systems come from changes how people behave inside them. Medieval societies did not always remember well, but when they did, their responses to crisis were calmer, faster, and less destructive. The difference was not better tools. It was better understanding. When people knew why a rule existed, they followed it differently. In moments when emergency memory was still alive, compliance was not blind. It was practical. People did not obey because they were ordered to. They obeyed because they had seen what happened when no one did. That kind of memory made rules feel protective instead of oppressive. It transformed restriction into cooperation. This distinction matters deeply. A curfew remembered as control breeds resentment. A curfew remembered as fire prevention feels reasonable. A ration remembered as theft sparks anger. A ration remembered as famine prevention encourages restraint. Medieval communities that kept these stories alive recovered faster because they trusted the logic behind the limits. Storytelling was the primary vehicle for this memory. Elders told younger generations about the winter when grain ran out, the fire that jumped rooftops, the sickness that spread through laughter and touch. These stories were not nostalgia. They were instruction manuals disguised as warnings. They explained why certain behaviors existed without needing formal education. As literacy spread, this memory moved into writing. Chronicles recorded disasters not just as events, but as lessons. What we failed to do, what we should never do again. These accounts were practical, blunt, and often repetitive. Repetition mattered, kept memory from fading too quickly. Modern societies often underestimate this function of history. We treat it as background knowledge rather than operational guidance. Medieval people treated it as survival data. Forgetting was dangerous. Remembering was protective. This is why rituals mattered even when they felt excessive. Fire drills, bell signals, inspection routines. They refreshed memory through action. You didn't just know the story, you practiced it. Practice turned abstract lessons into instinct. When memory weakened, behavior changed quickly. Preparedness declined. Complaints increased. Shortcuts multiplied. Medieval authorities recognized this pattern and tried, imperfectly, to counter it. They renewed rules publicly. They reread laws. They reenacted responses. These acts were not theater. They were reminders. What's striking is how modern life mirrors this cycle almost exactly. Long periods of stability dull urgency. Systems feel annoying. Compliance feels optional. Then crisis arrives, and everyone scrambles to remember why things exist the way they do. Confusion spreads not because systems are new, but because their purpose was forgotten. Another medieval lesson emerges here. Transparency matters. When authorities explained why measures existed, cooperation increased. When they relied solely on force, resistance grew. People tolerated hardship more easily when logic was shared. Silence bred suspicion. Explanation built patience. This is why public announcements evolved the way they did. Not just orders, but reasons. Not just commands, but context. Even imperfect explanations reduced panic. Understanding slowed emotional spikes. Medieval leaders who communicated clearly survived unrest more often than those who ruled by decree alone. Communities also learned to share responsibility for memory. It was not just the ruler's job to remember. Families taught children. Trades taught apprentices. Religious institutions preserved moral lessons tied to survival. Memory was distributed because centralized memory failed when institutions collapsed. This distributed memory created resilience. If one group forgot, another remembered. If one institution failed, habits remained. This redundancy mattered. It still does. The danger today is not that systems are inadequate. It's that their emergency routes are invisible. Without that context, people judge them only by comfort and convenience. When those expectations aren't met, trust erodes. Medieval history suggests a solution that feels simple but isn't easy. Keep telling the stories, not as fear-mongering but as explanation, not as trauma but as logic. Why this exists, what it prevents, what happens when it fails. In the very first moments of crisis, before leaders speak and before plans activate, something older takes over. Instinct. Medieval emergency thinking lives there now, embedded so deeply that most people never recognize it as learned behavior. Feels natural, automatic, obvious, but it was trained slowly across centuries of repetition. When danger appears, people look for signals, authority, boundaries, instructions. This reflex did not come from modern psychology. It came from generations who learned that hesitation killed and clarity saved. Medieval bells, flags, uniforms, and proclamations trained populations to scan for cues instead of freezing. Today, alerts, sirens, press briefings, and signage trigger the same response. Look up, listen, adjust. Crowds behave in recognizable ways for the same reason. People cluster, then separate. They seek exits. They mirror behavior. Medieval cities learned that unmanaged crowds became disasters themselves. Stampedes, riots, and panic spread faster than fire. So spacing, cues, barriers, and flow control emerged. These habits are now so ingrained that people line up instinctively even when no one tells them to. Buying behavior follows the same pattern. When uncertainty hits, people secure essentials first. Food, fuel, medicine. This is not greed. It is memory without words. Medieval famine taught communities that supplies disappear fastest at the start. Modern panic buying looks irrational until you recognize it as inherited survival logic firing without context. Information seeking also reveals its roots. People demand updates constantly during emergencies. Silence creates anxiety. Medieval societies learned that lack of information bred rumors, which bred chaos. Today's endless refresh behavior echoes that lesson. People aren't addicted to news. They're trying to reduce uncertainty the only way humans know how. Trust narrows under pressure as well. People rely on familiar sources, known voices, recognized institutions. Strangers feel risky. This bias protected medieval communities from deception during chaos. It still shapes behavior now, sometimes helpfully, sometimes harmfully. Rules suddenly feel acceptable again. Curfews, restrictions, documentation, and inspections that felt intrusive yesterday feel reasonable today. This switch confuses many people, but it's consistent. Emergency logic temporarily overrides comfort logic. Survival tolerance rises. Resistance falls. What's fascinating is how quickly this shift happens. It doesn't require persuasion. It doesn't need debate. It activates because it's already there. Medieval emergency systems trained populations to accept certain trade-offs instinctively when danger appears. That training never left. At the same time, cracks appear just as predictably. Mistrust of authority, accusations of overreach, resistance from those who don't feel threatened. Medieval history shows this split clearly. Communities fractured along perception of risk. Those who felt danger complied. Those who didn't resisted. This dynamic still defines crisis response. Leadership matters most here. Medieval leaders who acted early and clearly reduced chaos. Those who delayed or contradicted themselves amplified panic. Consistency mattered more than perfection. People preferred wrong certainty over conflicting truths. This uncomfortable lesson still shapes crisis communication today. Scapegoating also emerges quickly. Fear looks for blame. Medieval communities blamed outsiders, minorities, or deviants when explanations felt insufficient. Modern societies are not immune. The targets change. The pattern doesn't. Understanding this doesn't excuse it, but it helps predict and manage it. Time perception shifts too. Days blur. Urgency compresses decision-making. Long-term thinking narrows. Medieval emergency rules accounted for this by simplifying choices. Clear rules. Limited options. Reduced decision fatigue. Modern emergency protocols do the same. What all of this reveals is something deeply human. We are not inventing responses during crisis. We are remembering them without realizing it. Our bodies, habits, and expectations reach backward faster than our reasoning can catch up. This is why new emergencies feel strangely familiar even when the threat is unprecedented. The shape of response is old. The logic is ancient. Only the details change. If you're listening now, maybe recognizing some of these patterns from your own experience, that recognition is the point. Awareness slows panic. Understanding reduces frustration. Knowing why behavior shifts helps people navigate it with less fear. If this long, steady exploration is giving you that clarity, take a second to like the video. It helps this kind of thoughtful history reach people before the next crisis forces them to listen. What all of this finally points to is something both simple and difficult to accept. Modern life did not escape emergency thinking. It absorbed it. The rules, habits, systems, and instincts that surround us are not the result of calm design alone. They are the residue of people who lived through repeated fear and refused to collapse every time it returned. Understanding this changes how emergencies feel on a personal level. When rules tighten suddenly, it helps to remember that they were not invented to punish comfort. They were inherited to protect survival. When systems feel cold or slow, it helps to remember they were built to function when emotions ran high and judgment failed. They were not designed for kindness. They were designed for continuity. This perspective does not mean blind obedience is wise. Medieval history is clear about that too. Power without limits creates its own disasters. Resistance, negotiation, and memory shaped emergency systems just as much as authority did. The balance between control and freedom was never resolved once and for all. It is renegotiated every time fear returns. What medieval people learned, slowly and painfully, is that panic is more dangerous than restriction, but unchecked restriction is more dangerous than panic. Stability lives in the narrow space between them. Knowing this helps individuals move through crisis with clearer eyes. Not calmer necessarily, but steadier. For individuals, the lesson is practical. When emergencies arrive, confusion feels personal, but it isn't. It's biological and historical. Your urge to stock up, seek information, follow authority, question authority, worry about fairness, and scan for threats all come from deeply trained patterns. Recognizing that reduces shame and reduces conflict. It reminds you that you're responding like a human, not failing like an individual. It also restores agency. When you understand why systems exist, you can engage with them thoughtfully instead of emotionally. You can comply where it makes sense, question where it doesn't, and recognize when fear is driving reactions rather than facts. Medieval survival was never about eliminating fear. It was about using it without letting it rule. Another lesson is memory. The societies that suffered least were not the smartest or strongest. They were the ones that remembered past failures, remembered why rules existed, remembered what happened when shortcuts were taken. Memory softened panic and sharpened response. Modern life struggles here. Comfort erodes memory quickly. Stability feels permanent until it isn't. That doesn't mean we should live in fear. It means we should live informed. Knowing that systems were built for stress helps people tolerate friction when stress returns. There is also humility in this history. We like to believe we are more advanced, more rational, more prepared than the past. In truth, we are standing on their adaptations. When something breaks, we don't invent responses from scratch. We reach for medieval solutions wearing modern clothing. That's not failure. That's inheritance. Understanding this inheritance also creates patience. Patience with systems that feel imperfect. Patience with people who respond differently. Patience with yourself when clarity comes slowly. Emergencies compress time and inflate emotion. No one performs optimally. Medieval people didn't. Neither do we. If there is a quiet strength hidden in this story, it's this. Humanity has survived not by avoiding crisis, but by learning how to live inside it without tearing itself apart every time. The systems around you are proof of that. Flawed, frustrating, sometimes heavy-handed, but durable. As this story comes to a close, take a moment to notice where you are. Maybe you're listening on your phone, letting this play quietly. That habit itself is part of this long history. Stories told slowly to steady the mind, to pass memory without alarm, to prepare without panic. After the ending we reached, the story doesn't actually stop. It widens, because once emergency thinking becomes invisible, it doesn't just shape governments or cities. It moves inward. It settles into homes, relationships, and the quiet routines people rarely connect to survival at all. One of the most overlooked medieval emergency fixes was how households were organized. Homes were not private sanctuaries the way we imagine them today. They were safety devices, layouts, storage habits, shared spaces. Even sleeping arrangements were shaped by fear of fire, theft, sickness, and sudden scarcity. Families learned quickly that survival depended less on individual strength and more on shared readiness. Take food storage. Medieval households stored far more food than daily life required, even among the poor. Dry grains, salted meat, preserved vegetables, sealed fats. This was not hoarding. It was emergency buffering. Spoilage, theft, and failed markets were common. A household without reserves was a household already in danger. Over time, this behavior hardened into norms. Pantries became permanent features. Preservation methods became traditions. Today's cupboards, freezers, and bulk buying habits are echoes of that logic, even when abundance makes them seem unnecessary. The same applied to clothing. Medieval people owned fewer garments, but they maintained them obsessively. Repair mattered more than replacement. Extra layers were stored even in warm seasons because cold could arrive suddenly and fuel was unreliable. This practice wasn't about fashion or thrift. It was about insulation against unpredictability. Modern closets full of rarely used clothing feel different, but the instinct to prepare for future discomfort comes from the same place. Women, in particular, carried a large share of this emergency knowledge. They managed food safety, water cleanliness, child health, and household hygiene long before these were formal systems. Much of what we now call domestic routine began as crisis prevention. Boiling water, cleaning surfaces, isolating the sick, rotating supplies. These behaviors did not originate in comfort. They were learned responses to loss. Childbirth itself was treated as an emergency state. Medieval households prepared weeks in advance. Extra linens, heated water, restricted access, trusted attendance. These rituals later appeared as tradition, but they were rooted in risk management. Survival depended on anticipation, not reaction. Modern maternity practices carry the same structure, even if the danger feels reduced. Community networks extended this logic. Neighbors were backup systems. Shared wells, shared ovens, shared watch duties. These arrangements reduced individual vulnerability. Over time, they became social expectations rather than emergency agreements. Failing to participate wasn't just rude. It was dangerous. Modern ideas of community responsibility still draw from this logic, even as urban life hides it. Trust networks mattered as much as physical systems. Knowing who to rely on in crisis was essential. Medieval people kept mental maps of obligation and reliability. Who would share food? Who could be trusted with children? Who would hide you if authority turned hostile? These were not dramatic plots. They were quiet calculations repeated daily. Modern social circles still function this way under stress, even if we don't acknowledge it openly. Time management inside the home also reflected emergency thinking. Days were structured around light, weather, and risk. Tasks were ordered to minimize exposure and waste. Flexibility mattered more than efficiency. This contrasts sharply with modern schedules optimized for productivity. Yet when emergencies disrupt routines, people instinctively revert to prioritizing essentials over plans. Conflict resolution followed similar logic. Feuds and grudges were dangerous liabilities. Medieval households often practiced forced reconciliation after crises, not because forgiveness was virtuous, but because division weakened survival. This pattern appears again after modern disasters, when communities temporarily set aside differences before slowly returning to them. All of this reveals something important. Emergency systems did not only build institutions, they shaped daily life at the smallest scale. They taught people how to think about tomorrow, about others, about risk, and about responsibility. These lessons embedded themselves so deeply that they now feel like personality traits rather than inherited strategies. Money behaves differently when fear enters the room, and medieval people understood this long before modern economics tried to explain it. Trade, trust, and value were never stable concepts. They expanded and contracted based on safety. What we now treat as abstract financial systems began as emergency agreements between people who needed a way to survive uncertainty together. In medieval towns, money was not primarily about wealth. It was about reliability. Coinage mattered less than who accepted it. In times of stability, markets flourished, credit expanded, and trust widened beyond family and neighbors. But the moment crisis appeared, those circles snapped inward. Strangers became risks. Promises weakened. Physical goods replaced symbolic value. This is why medieval economies were obsessed with tangible measures. Weight, metal purity, visible marks. People needed proof that value would hold when trust collapsed. Debasement of coinage wasn't just an economic issue. It was a survival threat. When rulers diluted currency during emergencies, people responded instantly. Prices rose. Hoarding increased. Barter returned. These reactions weren't emotional. They were learned defenses. Credit systems show this clearly. In calm times, medieval merchants extended credit freely. Reputation substituted for collateral. But when famine, war, or plague loomed, credit tightened overnight. Cash mattered again. So did stored goods. This pattern still defines modern financial behavior under stress. Access to credit shrinks. Liquidity becomes king. The logic hasn't changed. Only the scale has. Women again played a central role here, often invisibly. Household-level trade, informal lending, and resource exchange were managed quietly to buffer families against market shocks. Lending grain, sharing tools, exchanging labor. These were microeconomies designed for resilience. Modern informal economies, especially during crisis, mirror this behavior almost exactly. Trust between strangers required safeguards. Contracts emerged not from legal obsession, but from emergency memory. People needed a way to transact without assuming goodwill. Written agreements, witnesses, seals, and later standardized terms all came from the same place. Reduce uncertainty. Limit damage if trust fails. Today's dense financial paperwork is an echo of that fear, not bureaucracy for its own sake. Markets themselves adapted physically. Medieval market days were scheduled carefully. Locations were controlled. Guards were present. Rules were enforced strictly, not to restrict trade, but to prevent panic and violence. Crowded markets under stress were dangerous. Order preserved access. Modern regulations around trading hours, disclosures, and halts follow the same logic, even if the original danger feels distant. Prices also told stories. Medieval people watched price movement closely because it signaled trouble before announcements did. Rising grain prices meant shortage or hoarding. Falling prices could signal desperation. These signals spread faster than official news. Today's market reactions to crisis still function this way. Fear moves value before facts arrive. Another emergency adaptation was diversification. Medieval traders rarely relied on a single route or partner if they could avoid it. Redundancy mattered. Multiple suppliers, multiple storage locations. These practices reduced catastrophic loss. Modern supply chains forgot this lesson in pursuit of efficiency, then rediscovered it painfully during disruption. Debt carried moral weight for similar reasons. Unpaid debts destabilized trust networks. Medieval communities often enforced debt forgiveness after disasters, not out of kindness, but because permanent obligation after shared catastrophe tore communities apart. Modern debt relief discussions after crises repeat this same argument, framed differently but rooted in identical logic. All of this shows that money systems are not neutral. They are emotional shock absorbers. They expand when people feel safe and contract when fear rises. Medieval emergency thinking shaped that elasticity. It taught societies how to survive financial stress without complete collapse. If you've ever noticed how your own financial instincts change during uncertain times, that's not personal weakness. It's inherited wisdom acting faster than rational planning. Time becomes heavier during crisis, presses in on people, tightens decisions, and reshapes priorities. Medieval societies learned this the hard way, and in doing so, they transformed time itself into an emergency tool. What we now experience as deadlines, schedules, urgency, and countdowns did not emerge from productivity culture. They emerged from fear of delay. In medieval life, time was once loose. Days followed light and weather more than clocks. Tasks expanded or shrank naturally. But emergencies punished this flexibility. Fire spread faster than response. Disease outran hesitation. Famine did not wait for convenience. Gradually, societies learned that delay was a form of danger. Time had to be measured, announced, enforced. This is where bells gained power. Church bells were not just religious instruments. They were emergency alarms. They marked danger, gatherings, curfews, and deadlines. A bell ringing outside its normal pattern meant something was wrong. People dropped what they were doing and responded immediately. This trained populations to associate sound with urgency, a reflex that still exists in sirens, alerts, and notifications today. Calendars also shifted meaning. They stopped being only religious or agricultural guides and became planning tools for risk. Certain seasons carried danger. Winter meant scarcity. Summer meant fire. Harvest delays meant hunger. These associations hardened into schedules. Deadlines weren't about efficiency. They were about survival windows. Miss them and consequences followed. Curfews reinforced this logic. Darkness increased risk. Crime, accidents, and fires spread more easily. Restricting movement wasn't about control for its own sake. It was about reducing exposure during the most dangerous hours. Over time, people internalized this rhythm. Even when curfews disappeared, nighttime caution remained. Labor organization changed too. Work became synchronized. People started tasks together, ended together, rested together. This wasn't social preference. It was coordination under threat. Emergencies required everyone available at the same time. Fragmented schedules weakened response. Modern work hours still reflect this collective timing, even when the original danger is gone. Punishment also followed time logic. Delays in payment, response, or obedience were penalized harshly during crisis periods. Speed mattered more than fairness. Medieval justice systems prioritized immediate compliance over nuanced judgment when danger was present. Modern emergency laws still reflect this tension. Waiting became suspicious. People who hesitated were seen as risks. This mindset persists. Slow response during crisis is judged harshly, even when caution might be rational. Speed feels safe because delay once killed. Technology intensified time pressure. Mechanical clocks spread not because people wanted precision, but because coordination saved lives. Knowing exactly when to act mattered. Bells rang on schedule. Markets opened on time. Gates closed at fixed hours. Precision reduced ambiguity. This obsession with time carried forward into modern crisis culture. Countdowns, timelines, curves, projections, all reflect the same medieval lesson. Act early or pay later. Time lost is safety lost. Psychologically, this compresses decision-making. People feel rushed, impatient, intolerant of debate. Medieval emergency culture normalized this trade-off. Thoughtfulness was sacrificed for action. That instinct still surfaces automatically. The cost of this is burnout and error. Medieval societies knew this too. After crises, time loosened again. Festivals returned. Deadlines softened. Recovery required slowing down. Modern life often forgets this release, staying permanently urgent. Understanding this helps explain why modern crises feel exhausting even when danger is abstract. We are activating ancient time instincts without the clear endpoints medieval life provided. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by urgency during uncertain periods, that feeling has deep roots. It's not personal failure. It's inherited pressure. If this exploration of time and urgency is helping you see modern stress differently, consider liking the video. It supports long-form storytelling that doesn't rush the listener. Movement is one of the first freedoms people notice, and one of the first things societies restrict when danger appears. Medieval emergency thinking shaped this instinct deeply. Roads, gates, borders, and permissions were not originally symbols of power. They were filters designed to slow threats that moved faster than information. In medieval towns, walls were not just defensive structures. They were control points. Gates closed at night not to inconvenience travelers, but to reduce unknown variables. Darkness hid disease, thieves, deserters, and panic itself. Every person entering after dark represented uncertainty. Limiting movement reduced the number of unknowns leaders had to manage. Passes and permissions grew from the same logic. Knowing who belonged and who didn't mattered when resources were thin and fear was high. During famine or plague, outsiders were not just strangers. They were potential vectors of collapse. Communities that failed to regulate movement often paid for it quickly. This lesson was learned repeatedly and painfully. Quarantine zones expanded this logic further. Entire streets, neighborhoods, or villages were sealed off when sickness appeared. These decisions were brutal. Families were separated. Trade halted. But medieval records show that communities which hesitated suffered worse outcomes. Movement restriction became associated with survival, not cruelty. Over time, these measures hardened into systems. Border controls, travel documents, residency requirements. What began as temporary filters became permanent expectations. People grew accustomed to proving who they were and where they belonged. Identity itself became a form of movement permission. What's important here is how quickly people adapted. Once danger felt real, resistance faded. Movement limits felt tolerable when framed as protection. This pattern remains remarkably consistent. Restrictions that would provoke outrage in calm times become acceptable almost overnight when fear rises. Medieval leaders understood framing instinctively. Restrictions explained as protection were obeyed more willingly than those enforced without explanation. Communication mattered. When people understood what movement limits prevented, compliance increased. Silence bred suspicion and defiance. Trade routes show another side of this story. While local movement tightened, essential routes were protected aggressively. Food, medicine, and fuel equivalents were prioritized. Guards were posted. Rules were bent. Movement was not eliminated. It was rationed. This selective freedom is a hallmark of emergency logic. Social hierarchy influenced movement as well. Certain people moved more freely because their roles were considered essential. Messengers, healers, food suppliers. This wasn't favoritism. It was triage. Modern essential worker classifications reflect the same reasoning. There was also a psychological effect. Restricted movement increased community identity. People focused inward. Local bonds strengthened. Outsiders became abstractions. This helped survival but deepened division. Medieval societies accepted this trade-off. Unity inside mattered more than openness outside during danger. After crises passed, movement loosened slowly. Restrictions lingered longer than the threat. People had adapted to them. Fear faded gradually, not instantly. This created tension. When does protection become control? Medieval history is full of arguments over this question, and it remains unresolved today. What's striking is how modern reactions mirror this exactly. The language changes, the technology changes, but the logic doesn't. Control movement to slow risk. Prioritize essentials. Accept limits temporarily. Argue about when temporary becomes permanent. Understanding this doesn't make restrictions easier emotionally, but it makes them less mysterious. They are not inventions of modern overreach. They are inherited responses that surface whenever uncertainty spikes beyond tolerance. Law thickens during fear. Medieval societies learned that uncertainty multiplies conflict faster than violence does. When people don't know what is allowed, what will be punished, or who decides, panic fills the gap. Emergency thinking responded by doing something that feels counterintuitive today. It added rules, not to control life completely, but to remove ambiguity when ambiguity became dangerous. In calm periods, medieval law was flexible, negotiable, and often informal. Custom mattered as much as statute. Disputes were settled through mediation, reputation, and local knowledge. But emergencies broke this model. Too many decisions had to be made too quickly. Too many lives depended on consistency. Flexibility became a liability. During crisis, laws hardened. Penalties became clearer and often harsher. Exceptions narrowed. Discretion shrank. This wasn't because leaders suddenly became cruel. It was because unclear enforcement caused hesitation, and hesitation caused collapse. People needed to know exactly what would happen if they acted or didn't act. Fear demanded certainty. This is why medieval emergency laws often read blunt and unforgiving. Curfew violations punished severely. Price controls enforced rigidly. Hoarding criminalized. Movement restricted without appeal. These rules feel extreme when read out of context. But in context, they served one function above all else. They removed decision paralysis. Fairness, in the modern sense, was often sacrificed. Two people committing the same act under different circumstances might receive the same punishment anyway. Emergency law prioritized predictability over nuance. People accepted this trade-off temporarily because the alternative was chaos. What's important is that medieval societies understood this was dangerous if left unchecked. Emergency laws were often tied to specific conditions: plague, famine, a siege. When those conditions ended, laws were supposed to soften again. The tension wasn't between law and freedom. It was between temporary necessity and permanent power. Many conflicts arose when emergency laws outlived the emergency. People tolerated restriction when fear was fresh. They resisted when fear faded. Medieval history is full of revolts sparked not by the crisis itself, but by leaders refusing to release control afterward. This pattern repeats endlessly. Clarity mattered more than severity. Laws that were clearly explained, publicly announced, and consistently enforced generated less resistance, even when harsh. Arbitrary enforcement bred rebellion. Medieval authorities learned that communication was as important as punishment. People could endure restriction if they understood its purpose. Written law expanded dramatically because of this. Oral custom failed under stress. Memory faltered. Written rules reduced argument. They created shared reference points when trust was thin. This is one reason legal systems grew denser over time. Not because people loved paperwork, but because emergencies demanded shared certainty. Another adaptation was standardization. Measurements, penalties, procedures. Standard units reduced disputes. Standard fines reduced negotiation. Standard processes reduced delay. These systems feel bureaucratic now, but they were survival tools then. There was also an emotional function. Clear rules reduced anxiety. Knowing what was forbidden, even if restrictive, felt safer than guessing. This psychological relief mattered. Fear feeds on uncertainty. Law, when clear, starves it. Modern emergency legislation follows the same logic almost perfectly. Temporary powers, expanded enforcement, simplified rules, reduced appeals. The debate always returns afterward. Were these measures necessary? When should they end? Who decides? Medieval societies asked the same questions, just without modern language. Understanding this helps explain why people react so strongly to emergency laws today. Support and resistance are both rooted in ancient experience. One side remembers survival. The other remembers abuse. Both memories are valid. For individuals, recognizing this pattern can soften reaction. Laws multiplying during crisis aren't proof that society has failed. They are proof that society is trying to stabilize itself under pressure. The danger comes when pressure lifts and the laws remain unchanged. When fear spreads, people don't just look for rules. They look for voices. Medieval emergency thinking shaped this instinct as well, determining who was trusted, who was ignored, and who was feared when uncertainty made independent judgment feel impossible. In medieval crises, expertise mattered, but not in the modern credentialed sense. Trust was built through visible competence under pressure. Healers who stayed when others fled. Messengers who returned with accurate information. Elders whose warnings proved correct over time. Authority did not come from titles alone. Came from survival outcomes. This is why medieval societies often clung to certain figures even when their explanations were incomplete or flawed. In emergencies, consistency mattered more than perfection. A steady voice reduced panic even if it lacked full understanding. Silence, contradiction, or hesitation eroded trust instantly. Medical trust followed this pattern sharply. Medieval medicine mixed observation, tradition, and belief. Treatments were imperfect, sometimes harmful, but communities learned to value practitioners who explained their actions, stayed present, and acted decisively. Fear tolerated error more easily than abandonment. This created an important distinction. Expertise was not defined by accuracy alone, but by reliability. Someone who acted predictably and visibly was trusted over someone who disappeared or constantly revised their stance. This explains why certain practices persisted long after their effectiveness was questioned. They provided emotional stability in chaos. Specialization grew out of this dynamic. Blacksmiths, midwives, masons, healers. Each role carried emergency importance. When crisis hit, people deferred quickly to those associated with survival-critical skills. This deference became habitual. Over time, it formed the basis of professional authority. But medieval societies were also wary. Blind trust had consequences. False healers, profiteers, and opportunists emerged whenever fear created demand. Communities learned to balance trust with skepticism. Reputation mattered. Past behavior mattered. Word spread quickly when someone failed under pressure. This tension between trust and doubt still defines modern crisis response. People search for experts, then question them intensely. They cling to certain voices, reject others, and argue over credibility. This isn't modern confusion. It's inherited behavior shaped by centuries of mixed outcomes. Religious authorities played a complex role here as well. In emergencies, spiritual explanations offered meaning when practical solutions failed. This reduced despair. But when explanations contradicted lived experience, trust fractured. Medieval records show moments when faith stabilized communities and moments when it deepened division. The lesson medieval societies learned was not to eliminate authority, but to distribute it. No single voice should carry all trust. Redundancy mattered. Multiple experts, overlapping responsibilities, shared accountability. This reduced the damage when one failed. Modern systems echo this through committees, peer review, and layered decision-making. These structures feel slow and frustrating until crisis hits. Then they provide resilience. No single failure collapses the whole response. Emotionally, people gravitate towards certainty during fear. Experts who communicate clearly, even when admitting limits, retain trust longer than those who appear evasive. Medieval leaders who said, "We don't know, but here's what we're doing," fared better than those who promised certainty they couldn't deliver. This reveals something important about human behavior. Trust is not built on perfection. It's built on presence, clarity, and consistency. Emergency thinking trained populations to value these traits because lives depended on them. If you've ever noticed how quickly people rally around certain voices during uncertain times, or how fiercely they reject others, you're seeing medieval logic still at work. The names change. The platforms change. The instinct doesn't. Information becomes dangerous during crisis, not because it is false, but because it moves faster than understanding. Medieval emergency thinking recognized this early. Rumors killed almost as effectively as famine or disease. Panic spread faster than armies. And once fear took shape in words, it was almost impossible to pull back. In medieval towns, news traveled by mouth. There were no neutral channels. Every message carried emotion, interpretation, and bias. A single exaggerated story could empty a market, spark violence, or trigger flight. Communities learned that unmanaged information was a threat that required containment, just like fire or illness. This is why information control emerged as an emergency fix. Town criers were not simply messengers. They were filters. Their role was to standardize information, reduce variation, and slow distortion. Announcements followed set language. Tone mattered. Repetition mattered. Calm delivery mattered. The goal was not persuasion. It was stabilization. Silence was rarely accidental. Medieval leaders often delayed announcements deliberately, not to hide truth, but to avoid uncontrolled reaction before plans were ready. They understood something deeply uncomfortable. Bad news delivered without structure causes more harm than bad news delayed with preparation. This logic still governs crisis communication, even when people resent it. Rumor suppression followed harsh paths. Spreading unverified information during emergencies could be punished severely, not because truth was unwelcome, but because speed without certainty created chaos. Medieval records show people executed, fined, or exiled for causing panic through speech alone. Words were treated as weapons when fear was high. At the same time, complete suppression backfired. When people sensed information was being withheld entirely, they filled the gap themselves. Fear prefers explanation, even a false one, over emptiness. Medieval societies learned that partial transparency worked better than total control. Enough information to calm, not enough to overwhelm. This balance was fragile. Leaders who misjudged it lost legitimacy quickly. Too much optimism bred distrust. Too much alarm bred paralysis. The most successful responses shared three traits: clear acknowledgement of danger, visible action, regular updates. These patterns appear again and again across centuries. Written notices expanded this system. Posting laws, warnings, and instructions publicly reduced rumor by creating shared reference points. People could point to something solid instead of relying on memory. This reduced argument and speculation. Modern official statements, dashboards, and updates serve the same purpose. Control of narrative mattered too. Medieval authorities framed crises using familiar language and symbols. Religious metaphors, moral explanations, seasonal logic. Not because they were always accurate, but because familiarity reduced panic. People accept danger more easily when it fits an existing story. Novel threats without narrative provoke more fear. Information hierarchy also emerged. Not every voice carried equal weight. Elders, officials, clergy, and respected tradespeople were expected to relay information responsibly. Social pressure enforced this role. Someone known for exaggeration quickly lost trust. Reputation acted as quality control. Modern media ecosystems amplify this dynamic dramatically. Speed has increased. Reach has expanded. But the emotional mechanics are identical. Fear seeks confirmation. People share information that matches anxiety faster than information that calms it. Medieval rumor moved at walking pace. Modern rumor moves instantly. The instinct driving it is unchanged. This is why corrections struggle. Once fear anchors to a story, logic arrives too late. Medieval communities learned that prevention mattered more than correction. Clear early messaging reduced rumor growth. Delay allowed false narratives to harden. Another medieval lesson is repetition. Calm information repeated consistently beats dramatic information delivered once. This is counterintuitive in modern attention culture, but it worked then and still does. Familiar messages feel safer. Repetition signals control. Emotion regulation was always the hidden goal. Emergency information was designed not just to inform, but to stabilize behavior. What should people do next? Where should they go? What should they avoid? Action reduces panic more effectively than reassurance alone. What's striking is how often modern crises fail at this exact point. Too much data, too many voices, conflicting explanations. Medieval systems were simpler out of necessity. Fewer voices, clear authority, limited updates. That simplicity reduced emotional overload. Understanding this helps explain why people sometimes gravitate toward overly simple explanations during crisis. It's not ignorance. It's stress management. The mind seeks clarity when overwhelmed. Medieval emergency thinking trained populations to value decisiveness over completeness. If you've ever felt exhausted by constant updates during uncertain times, that reaction is not weakness. It's a mismatch between ancient emotional systems and modern information volume. When formal authority feels distant or overwhelmed, communities turn inward. Medieval emergency thinking relied heavily on this shift. Social enforcement became as powerful as law, sometimes more so. Shame, reputation, and collective judgment filled gaps that rules alone couldn't reach. In medieval life, survival depended on cooperation. One person's behavior could endanger many. A careless fire, a hidden illness, hoarded food, silence when warning was needed. Because risk was shared, enforcement became shared too. Communities watched each other closely during crisis, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of consequences spreading. Shame functioned as an emergency tool. It was fast, visible, and effective. Public disapproval corrected behavior without requiring formal trials. Being labeled reckless or dangerous could isolate someone quickly. In emergencies, isolation itself became a deterrent. No one wanted to be cut off from shared resources or protection. This is why medieval punishment often focused on visibility rather than confinement. Public scolding, forced apologies, markers of wrongdoing. These acts reinforced boundaries without removing labor or manpower entirely. Prisons were expensive. Shame was efficient. Reputation systems grew stronger under stress. Past behavior mattered more than promises. Someone known for honesty gained trust faster. Someone known for selfishness faced suspicion immediately. Medieval communities kept long memories because forgetting patterns was dangerous. Social roles intensified too. People felt pressure to perform responsibility publicly. Caring for the sick, sharing supplies, following rules visibly. Compliance became performative because visibility reassured others. Seeing cooperation reduced panic. Seeing defiance magnified it. This dynamic explains why communities sometimes reacted harshly to minor violations. The act itself mattered less than what it signaled. A small breach suggested larger breakdowns ahead. Medieval emergency thinking treated early signals as warnings, not overreactions. At the same time, this system carried risks. Fear sharpened judgment. Mistakes were punished as intent. Outsiders and vulnerable individuals were scrutinized more intensely. Deviance, real or perceived, attracted attention. Medieval history records many moments where social enforcement tipped into injustice. Yet communities accepted this risk because the alternative felt worse. Unchecked behavior threatened everyone. The balance between protection and harm was never stable. It shifted with fear levels. Modern crisis behavior reflects this clearly. Social pressure increases. Norms tighten. Deviations are called out publicly. Online spaces amplify this effect, but the instinct itself is ancient. People police each other because centralized systems feel too slow. What's striking is how quickly people accept this role. They don't wait for instruction. They enforce norms instinctively. Medieval emergency culture trained populations to see themselves as part of the response, not passive subjects. There was also a corrective side. Communities sometimes protected individuals from excessive punishment. Elders intervened. Reputations were defended. Mercy appeared when fear eased. Social enforcement softened as stability returned. Forgiveness mattered after crisis. Reintegrating people preserved labor, trust, and continuity. Medieval societies learned that permanent exclusion weakened recovery. Even serious violations were often followed by rituals of return once danger passed. This cycle of tightening and loosening social control repeats consistently. Fear contracts tolerance. Safety expands it. Understanding this rhythm helps explain why social conflict spikes during emergencies and slowly fades afterward. For individuals, recognizing this pattern can reduce personal stress. Feeling watched, judged, or pressured during uncertain times is not a personal failure. It's a communal reflex shaped by centuries of shared risk. What medieval emergency thinking ultimately teaches is not how to avoid fear, but how to live with it without letting it destroy everything around it. Across centuries of fires, plagues, famines, wars, and sudden collapse, people did not survive by becoming fearless. They survived by building habits, systems, and stories that allowed fear to exist without turning into chaos. Every system we've talked about, rules, time pressure, movement limits, expert trust, information control, social enforcement, all of it came from the same realization. When danger appears, humans don't need perfection. They need orientation. They need to know what matters right now, what can wait, and who to listen to until clarity returns. Medieval societies learned this through loss, not theory. What's easy to forget is that none of these systems were meant to be permanent. They became permanent because danger never fully disappeared. One crisis faded and another arrived. Each time, the same tools were reused, adjusted, normalized. Over generations, people stopped seeing them as emergency responses and started seeing them as just how things are. That forgetting is where friction begins. Systems built for survival start to feel heavy during comfort. Rules designed for speed feel unfair during calm. Restrictions built for protection feel intrusive when risk feels distant. This doesn't mean the systems are evil or outdated. It means they're being judged outside the context that created them. Medieval people argued about this constantly. When should restrictions end? Who decides? How much control is too much? These debates are not modern failures. They are ancient conversations resurfacing in new language. Understanding that can soften how we experience them. There is also a quieter lesson here, one that applies personally, not politically. When emergencies arrive, whether large or small, external or internal, our reactions often surprise us. We rush. We cling to routines. We seek authority. We get irritated by ambiguity. We judge others quickly. These responses are not flaws. They are inherited strategies trying to stabilize uncertainty. Knowing that gives you space. Space to pause before reacting. Space to recognize fear without amplifying it. Space to understand why others respond differently. Medieval survival was communal. No one made it through crisis alone. That truth hasn't changed. Another lesson is humility. Modern life feels advanced, optimized, and controlled until it isn't. When systems strain, we don't invent entirely new responses. We reach backward instinctively, even if we don't recognize the source. That's not regression. It's continuity. It's proof that some solutions endure because they worked often enough to be remembered. The danger isn't that we rely on old systems. The danger is forgetting why they exist. When memory fades, patience fades with it. Understanding restores perspective. Perspective reduces panic. Panic reduction is, and always has been, one of the most powerful emergency tools humans possess. As this story comes to a close, think about how many of these medieval fixes are present in your everyday life, quietly shaping how you plan, worry, trust, and prepare. They're not signs that the world is fragile. They're signs that humanity learned how to survive fragility without starting over each time. If this long journey through history helped you see modern life with a little more clarity, or simply helped you slow down, leave a comment and share what stood out to you. And if you haven't already, like the video and subscribe. It helps keep thoughtful, patient storytelling alive in a space that often rushes past understanding. History doesn't sit behind us. It lives inside our habits, remembering that may be the calmest response to fear we've ever learned.